your initials, whatever you're comfortable with. And also in the participant window, if you hover over your name, you'll also see an option for more, and you can rename yourself there as well. So that's everything I needed to share with you. So I'll turn things over to Susan.
Good morning. Thank you, Christine. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Susan Wu, a consultant from the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium, and also representing the Alberta Regional Learning Consortium. We are very excited to be joined by one of the leading researchers in educational assessment, Dr. Thomas Guskey, for conversations to guide and clarify assessment practice for supporting learning at home. Recently, on April 7th, Thomas Guskey and Rick Romelli spoke to Alberta school leaders in a webinar called Considerations for Assessment and Grading in a Pandemic Online World. In that session, we had asked school leaders across the province, what burning questions do you have about assessment and grading in a prolonged online learning environment? We compiled the top 10 questions, and Tom and Rick addressed those questions. And now we're back because you asked very good questions, and it generated some great discussions and some even more good questions. So Tom is here today to continue the learning and to further the conversations that have been started provincially. Thomas is a senior research scholar in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Louisville and Professor Emeritus in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. He is also the author and editor of 25 award-winning books and more than 250 book chapter articles, professional papers on educational measurement, evaluation, assessment, grading, and professional learning. So please give us a warm welcome for Dr. Thomas Guskey.
Thanks, Susan. Well, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. I know we here are starting week 6 of our social isolation. Some of you may even be further along in that process, but it's kind of exciting to come together like this. We have a wonderful group of educators that are a part of our session today. We have most of our folks are from Alberta, but we've got folks from all across Canada, some from the US, even some from Europe are going to be joining us today. So to everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for coming together during this time. One of the things that I think is unique about this experience is it does bring us together in having shared problems and difficulties. So we're going to try to use our time this morning well to address some of those and understand what those issues are. The major thing is how are we going to handle this assessment when we're supporting learning at home? All of our students now are not in our schools. They're at home trying to learn as best we can, and we're trying to coordinate their learning experience as best we can. So what we're going to try to do this morning is establish some priorities, look at what we can do with regard to assessments, and then carry forward and see how we can do that well. I wanted to start by, again, sharing with you some contact information for me, some ways that you can get in touch with me if there are other questions and concerns that follow today. I do have a website. Many of you know, it's just tguskey.com. If you want to contact me by email, that's my email address. It's at the university, guskey@uky.edu. I do follow Twitter, and you can contact me through Twitter as well. It's just @tguskey, and that is my telephone number. And if you call that number, though, the cell phone that's sitting right beside me here is going to ring. So it's not as though many people are going to get between us in our communication. I wanted to indicate, too, that we did, in looking at your questions, try to organize our session this morning to have 3 major sort of learning targets. First of all, we wanted to recognize some of the inequalities that we're going to have to deal with as we work with students in this sort of remote learning situations and explore ways that we can do our best to work around those. Second, we want to understand the effective use of traditional and alternative forms of assessment. I'd like to share with you some of the different assessment formats that are available to us and understand how they really do measure different things and how working in a sort of a distance learning or remote learning situation changes that a bit. And finally, we want to look at developing guidelines for ensuring that assessments serve as learning tools and really facilitate learning on the part of our students rather than just evaluation devices. So with that in mind, we did set up this morning's session to have certain chat groups set up. That's correct, Susan. Did we do that? We have chat groups ready to go?
We can create them right away for you, Thomas.
Okay, because we wanted to start by just giving you the opportunity to share with some of your colleagues and consider two big questions here. The one is that what are your biggest questions regarding assessment, especially as we're working and trying to support learning at home? And then what are the biggest assessment problems you have? So if we could, Susan, go to those sort of chat groups and have folks just take about 2 minutes to describe and see what commonalities we share, what unique experiences we might be shared as we move in this direction. So we'll take a short break now. We'll take you into chat groups, and in those chat groups, then explore these two issues. What are your questions? What are your biggest concerns? And see if some of those are shared. We'll make sure that we try to address those. We got some information about those early on, but we want to make sure we take those on today. So Susan and Christine, may we move to that now for about 2 minutes?
Sure, 2 minutes is good.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Everyone that's in the Zoom room, what will happen is you'll see a pop-up that's asking you to join a breakout room number. You'll have to click the blue, the blue button to join the room. If you don't see it pop up on your screen in a few seconds, you might have to exit the full screen and it might be hiding behind your current window. When the 2 minutes is over, I will send a call for you back to the room. So you'll get a message that your breakouts will be ending in 60 seconds so you can wrap up the conversations and then click the request to come back to the main room. Mm-hmm. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We'll see those as well. Mm-hmm. Also, you'll have to unmute your mic and your camera when you get into those breakout rooms. Mm-hmm. Okay, you should see that appear now.
Okay, good. Yep, I'm going to join on.
And Thomas, if you want, you can pop in and out of those rooms. And those people that are joining us in the live, you could have that discussion in the chat window of the live. I'm going to unmute your microphones here in this main room. I see a few of you haven't gone into those breakouts. If you need help, please let me know. Again, you should see a pop-up window that asks you to join a particular breakout room. If you don't see it, you might need to exit the full screen so that you see that window pop up behind there. But please let me know if you need any help with that.
Hi, Lori.
Is my sound on? Hi, Susan. How are you?
Good. How are you? Everyone's just in a chat room right now.
Oh, right on.
Yeah. Did you want to join one, or did you want to? Because we're coming back in a few minutes.
You know what? I have some other stuff I'm gonna do, so I will just chill for right now. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll just clarify for those people that are joining us on the YouTube live stream. I don't have the option to break you out into rooms while you're in the live stream link, but you can discuss whatever it is that Thomas is talking about, asking those people to do in the breakouts in the chat. So that's awesome. I see lots of people in the YouTube live chat are putting their questions and discussing in there. I will feed some of that information to Thomas as well as much as I can.
Thanks, Nicole. Are we back now? Okay.
There's still some people that are coming back. It's 7 seconds and they'll all be put back into the main room.
Do I need to go back to the screen share?
Yes.
Okay, so let me again.
And the breakout room people all should be back now from the Zoom.
So as you're all coming back out of the chat rooms and back into our main session with Thomas Guskey, just a reminder that we are going to restrict the chat later this morning in the last half an hour to the Alberta context. I know we might have some people who are joining us from other areas, but this intended conversation was to focus on in looking at assessment in the Alberta context. Okay, Thomas, we'll have you resume, please.
Contribute to inequity that we really need to recognize and find ways to work around. When you think about this idea of supporting learning from home, there are a number of sort of equity issues that come to play for us. Number one is there's inequity with regard to technology. We know that we have this vision that this is what all of our students have available to them at home, but they don't. And so we need to be considering this tremendous disparity among our students in terms of what internet availability they have, the broadband width that's available to them, what hardware they have, what software they have. Almost all of our schools have moved to providing paper versions of learning supplies and materials for students that don't have the internet access, but we always need to keep this in mind as we go forward. A second kind of inequity is just the inequity to access to school supplies. Not all homes have the even paper and pencils and pens we might want them to be able to have. And so as we think about assessments, especially demonstrating learning, we need to think about, do students have access to these materials that might be necessary prerequisites for them to do those things? And finally, and probably the most important, is just the inequity that's involved in the parent support. There's tremendous disparity in homes as far as what parent support is available to kids. In particular, we know that there are many children in homes where the parents actually work outside the home. And even with the pandemic, their jobs require them still to be there each day. And so they're not necessarily there to support their children or even to monitor what they might be doing. A second is the idea of multiple children at different grade levels in the home. So when you have multiple kids at different grade levels and they're working on different things, it's hard to proportion what time they're going to be available online and when you can get that work done. Third, oftentimes parents don't feel really well prepared to offer the kind of support that we would hope. We find, especially among students at the high school level, their parents often don't feel that they have knowledge base or the skills that are necessary to help their children with these learning activities. We also know that many of our children come from homes where English is not the first language. And so again, that provides a sort of barrier for the parents supporting the kids in what they're going to do. And finally, we know that there are homes where the parents are also teachers. And so in those homes, the parents not only have to provide instruction for their students, but try to support the learning for their children. And all these difficulties sort of work against us. It's not necessarily that we'll be able to resolve any of them, but we need to be conscious of those and keep those sort of at the forefront as we go through this. I'd like to, in the time we have available, offer you sort of 3 guidelines for assessment practice, things that can really contribute to helping learning situations, especially when we're looking at learning from home, that could be really powerful and really important for the kind of work we're asking our teachers to do. So first of all, it's going to be necessary as leaders that you establish some assessment priority and then clearly communicate that to everybody. One of the issues we find teachers are really struggling with in this opportunity to provide support for learning at home is they're not sure what the priority is with regard to assessment. We really have to make that clear. Now, when it comes to those priorities, with assessments, they basically serve two major purposes. The first is the really supporting learning in terms of feedback and learning. That we use assessments to gather information about whether our students are learning the things we had hoped they were learning or not, and how we've done in far as our instruction goes, but also to communicate to students what is important for them to learn and how well they've learned those things, and if they haven't, what we can do about that. Now, a second purpose for assessments is just the notion of sort of accountability and grading, that we feel compelled to include grades on report cards and have grades for transcripts and move in this direction. Now, this issue is where schools have made some changes. The article that you read, for example, in preparation for today, noted that in many colleges and universities throughout Canada, and especially here in the States too, very elite universities have really recognized that their faculty are really struggling to provide learning experience for students, and to ask them to find and discriminate these levels of student performance has really proven difficult. So many universities are moving to a sort of credit or no credit or sort of success or incomplete kind of grading system. Now, where they set the cutoffs for that does differ drastically. And I think one of the major challenges we face is that sometimes people feel, well, if you go pass fail, then just passing is such a minimum level of performance, and students will only do that minimum. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can set that level for successful completion wherever you want. It's just a professional judgment you have to make on your part. The key point here, though, is that if you think about these two assessment purposes, we are not going to be able to do both well. And so we need to make some choices with regard to our priorities. And if you choose feedback and learning as your priority, then the implications of that are pretty clear. The first implication is that these two purposes do take you in different directions with regard to assessment. And as those directions come clear, once you establish your priority, then it makes the direction you're going to follow pretty clear. The first is, if your purpose is learning, then your real focus on assessment really isn't sort of quantifying achievement, but it's in providing this feedback. How we can give students accurate and useful feedback to guide their learning overall. That really does alter the distinction between formative and summative assessments as well. That formative and summative are not determined by the format of the assessment. You can't look at an assessment and determine whether it's formative or summative, but it's really by its purpose. And when feedback becomes the purpose, it changes that notion completely. So what we have then is that assessments are all going to be formative until our students demonstrate that they've got it. And as soon as they demonstrate they've got it, then we can consider that assessment to be summative. That brings us to the second point. And the second point is that different assessment formats require different types of feedback. And so that's why we always have to think of our learning goals first, and then what assessment format matches those learning goals. In Alberta, we've kind of decided that we want the focus to really be the essential learning outcomes, and recognize we can't do everything we've done before. So we need to focus on those essential outcomes. And that's really a very important thing to do. When you look at those assessment outcomes, then you need to think about the assessment format that best matches the outcome. And there are two ways you can go about it. There are traditional assessment formats, and they usually fall into these 5 types. We have true, false, matching, multiple choice, completion, and short answer. Now, a lot of people discourage these traditional sort of assessment formats, but they do have some advantages. First, they're fairly easy to develop, fairly easy to score. They allow you to capture a lot of information from students in a very short period of time. And they're pretty easy to then to document student performance. The disadvantage of these is that there are many types of learning outcomes that these kind of assessments don't really capture well. Now, if you're using these kinds of traditional formats, then there's very quick, efficient ways you can provide students with feedback on it, just by telling them whether they got the questions right or wrong. But it's also important to think about the way we can look at this information as a teacher to find out the effectiveness of my instruction. One of the things that I do with my classes when I use these traditional assessment formats is as soon as the assessment is completed, I make a tally for my class. And I just go through and I ask, how many students missed each question? This is an analysis from one of my classes. Now you can see, as I look at this, that my students did pretty well on the first part of the assessment, but when I get to questions 7 and 8, well, almost half the students in class missed that question. There's something really wrong there. Now, it could be that that was a bad question. That's the first thing I look for, because again, that's a teacher issue and I need to change the assessment because whatever I did there wasn't very good. But if I look at that question and I find that, no, actually it's a pretty good question. It's pretty clear that the way that I taught that for my students learning at home wasn't very good. And I need to find a different way of doing it. The same holds true. Look up there, question 12. I mean, question 12, I had 17 kids miss that question. Something is really wrong there. So when we think about feedback, think about it not only in terms of the feedback that we offer our students, but the feedback that we as teachers can gain from the assessment to really guide us in making our instruction all the more appropriate. Now, it gets even better if you can use common assessments. If 3 teachers all decide they're going to use the same assessment for their class, then you can do something like this. These results of a formative assessment of 3 different teachers. And what I'd like you to do, again, is just take a look at this. And if these were 3 teachers in your school who were teaching the same course or the same grade level and gave the same assessment, and these were the results in terms of how many students missed each question. As a leader, how would you have these teachers work together? What are the things that you would do as a leader to help these teachers coordinate their efforts to lead to improvements of all? And I'll give you just 2 minutes again to look at these results and see how this could guide those teachers in really making improvements to have their instruction become a lot more effective.
And would you like them to break out into small groups again, Thomas?
Sure, that would be great, Christine.
Okay. Again, the breakout rooms are for the people that are joining us with Zoom. Those people that are joining us in YouTube, you can discuss those things in the chat. And I'm opening up those breakout rooms. So people in Zoom, you should see the pop-up asking you to join. If you don't see that pop-up to join, you might need to exit your full screen to see that. Please let me know, people that are in Zoom, if you need help finding those breakout room options.
Oh, hi, Christine. I wasn't offered a room.
Let me see here. Okay, thank you for letting me know. I will. And sorry, who was that speaking? Laura, was it Lori? I have Lori. Okay, so I'm going to assign, I have a few people that must have joined us a little later than the last time. I'm going to just pop you into another breakout and you should see that option.
Of course he is.
Now, so everyone does have a room that they're assigned, but let me know if you still need help.
Are they coming back?
Susan, can you tell me, do we have any questions coming in yet?
More like comments here. One of them is, one of the challenges in Alberta is that the universities have not made a commitment either way, nor has the government clarified whether our Rutherford scholarships can move ahead in the absence of percentage grades. Pass-fail would be a great option.
Mhm.
But a lot of students will rely on that Rutherford scholarship. And so there's a lack of clarity from Alberta Education regarding that piece of whether we give percentage marks or not.
And tell me the basis of the Rutherford scholarships.
I believe it's just, students have to maintain a certain average in order to get their first year of university paid for.
I think it's 80 and over.
Okay. An
Yeah.
average across all classes then of 80?
I think it's their core classes. They have to have over 80 in all 4 cores.
All 4. Okay.
Or it's an 80 average, I believe.
Oh, an average. Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You also there is also some questions in the YouTube live.
A certain average in order to get their first.
Sorry, I think it's 80
Let's
and
get
over.
Okay. An average across all classes then of 80?
I think it's their core classes. They have to have over 80 in all 4 cores.
All 4. Okay.
Or it's an 80 average, I believe.
Oh, an average. Okay.
Okay.
Are you getting?
You could have a 70 in one if you had a 90 in another.
A certain average.
That could be right. I mean, you never know.
Susan, are you getting feedback from me?
I'm hearing a little bit of feedback.
Yeah.
Corey was struck. Well, he's not really struggling, but he already has a handicap.
Maybe someone else's mic is on in here.
Okay, so let's get back together.
Sorry, yes, I will call them back. I was going to say there is a question in the chat on YouTube about having students that do not have access to digital technology and have just welcome to assessment ideas on that in general. And then someone specifically asked about CTF and CTF courses and how they evaluate those courses fairly when the point of those courses are to be reduce the theory and increase hands-on work.
Of assessments.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So are we back, everybody? Let's see.
Sorry, we have them all back now, Thomas.
Okay. I've lost. Here we are. Okay. Okay. Sometimes our learning goals cannot be captured by traditional assessments, and so we have to think about alternative assessments. Now, these are not necessarily non-traditional because we've all had experience with them, and they're assessment formats that we use at basically any grade level. Skill demonstrations, for example, kindergarten teachers use, and they're used through graduate and professional schools. Oral presentations, task performances, writing compositions, lab experiments. Now, learning at home does pose some limitations on these, and especially when students don't have the technology available to them. But if we decide these are things we're going to use to actually provide students with that kind of feedback on their learning, that we must recognize that the key to success with alternative assessments is really having clearly specified performance criteria scoring rubrics. Students need to know. Now, the advantage you have is that when you make assessments primarily establishing for feedback purposes, then it takes a burden off of students in terms of that sort of accountability. Now, if it's feedback and they're really designed to help them learn, then cheating really does no service at all. It actually deters your opportunity to gain feedback and gain that assistance for it overall. But if we move to these alternative assessments, that becomes all the more important, that we have to establish these criteria by which that can be held. Now, I'm particularly fond of the work of Susan Brookhart when it comes to these sort of criterion establishing rubrics. And Susan in her work makes the point that a rubric is really a coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of levels of performance for those criteria. And this definition then implies two parts for any particular rubric. The first is that we have to have a set of criteria for really what counts. If I look at a skill or a demonstration, or I look at a composition, what are the things in that I'm really looking for that really count? And then within each of those criteria, can I distinguish sort of levels of quality from what is really excellent to what is poor? Now, the advantage we have is that we've done some important work in this area to give us ideas of how to do these things well. Again, Sue comes through and talks about the way to think about this is rubrics are not really designed to judge performance, but actually describe performance. So if you think about describing the performance and really what is excellent performance, then it provides you with clear guidelines for how you would develop these rubrics. But there are three insights to developing these rubrics that have come out from more recent research on assessments that we really have to keep in mind. The first is a different alternative perspective on how we develop them. When this movement toward sort of outcomes or standards was first developed, and we started developing rubrics associated with them, we had this idea that we should start with some sort of level of proficiency. And in a sort of a numeric scale, that was typically considered like a level 3. We had a couple of levels leading up to it, but then we always had a level above. That was that top level, that exemplary, that exceeding level. And that worked okay. It worked okay at the elementary grades because the level above was always fairly easy to establish. The level above was always just the next grade level. So if I'm working on 3rd grade level outcomes, working on the level above would be 4th grade outcomes. Problems occurred though when we tried to move that to the middle school and high school level, because the concern of students and their parents and even of teachers there was not what do I have to do to be proficient, it's what do I have to do to get that highest grade possible. And so the new approach we've taken to the development of rubrics is not to start in the middle and go up and down, but to start at the top. Start with your model of excellence. What do you expect for that top category performance? Really describe what excellent performance would look like, and then sort of move down from there. So as you think of establishing these rubrics aligned with the essential learning outcomes, that you always want to think about what a top level performance would be with regard to the outcome. What would I give a high grade for students in that level, and have that be the guideline that you use for developing your rubric. The second thing we know is that oftentimes we made our rubrics too complicated and they lost their value as learning tools. To be valuable as a learning tool, we find that a rubric can include no more than about 3 or 4 criteria. Beyond that, it's very difficult for students to use it as a learning tool. Students can't keep track of 10 things. And so in a writing class, for example, if students write a composition for me, I can't evaluate their composition in terms of 10 different criteria. I've got to get it down to about 3 or 4. Now, that doesn't mean that I always have to use the same 3 or 4. It could be that I would start off and my students would write a composition for me. I'd evaluate in terms of these 4 criteria, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the second composition, I might give them feedback on 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, by the third composition, everybody pretty much has 1 down. So what I could do with the third composition is maybe criteria 2, 3, 4, and 5. So over an instructional sequence, I might cover many more criteria, but on any single demonstration, you've got to get it down to no more than about 3 or 4. That would be a valuable learning tool. And finally, always think of it in terms of describing what that level of performance looks like rather than evaluating. And our idea is that all students can learn, and while all students can get that top level, we need to provide them with feedback that's going to move them to that level. Now, with alternative assessments, it's a real challenge for you, especially when students are learning at home. Now, one of the advantages we find is that if students are turning in material to you, learning from home in an online format, is to use what we call screencasting. Screencasting is a technology. There are many screencasting programs you can actually download for free. And what they allow you to do is to look at that sample of student work online and provide students with up to 2 minutes of verbal feedback on their work. You can go through the criteria, say this is what you did really well, this is what you need to work on a little bit better, and here's how you can make it better. So screencasting is a way of doing that. When it comes to the paper formats, students don't have the technology at home, we're probably going to be stuck with sort of written comments unless you have the opportunity to talk to students on the phone. That brings me to the third and last point that I want to share with you. And that is if feedback becomes your really important device and learning becomes your important focus, then we need to make sure assessments are an integral part of the instructional process. We want to help students see assessments as learning tools rather than just evaluation devices. To get out of that, if it's a learning tool, it's there to help you, not to evaluate you, not to put you into a category. But to do that, there are three powerful implications that come about. The first is that students have to see assessments as source of information, and we as teachers do too. And a source of information, meaning that we need to be communicating to students very clearly what is important for them to learn. An assessment should not be a surprise to students. If something is on the assessment that's a surprise for students, then something went wrong in the teaching. Their assessments need to be very direct. They need to reflect exactly what we stressed and were an important part of the instruction, and an important source of information for us as teachers. That assessments let us know what came across well, where our instruction really worked, and then where we need to make some changes in it overall. We've all had experiences in classes where we might have had a big test coming up and you studied very hard, put a lot of time and effort into preparation. We needed to take the test, and as you read it over, you said to yourself, oh my goodness, this isn't what I studied. Well, it wasn't a very effective learning experience for you. The one thing it taught me, and because when it happened to me too, it taught me two things. The first thing it taught me was that my hard work and effort didn't matter in school, because I worked really hard for the test and it didn't seem to make a difference at all. And the second thing it taught me was you can't trust teachers. Well, assessment shouldn't be like that. You know, assessment should really reflect what we kind of is important for them to learn. And we really need to be able to do that and need to be able to think about that as a part of what we do for our students as well. That we need to be looking at the assessment results and figuring out what in our instruction worked well and where can we make some changes. That's implication number one. Implication number two stems from that. That if assessments provide that feedback, then the feedback is really three things. It lets students what they were expected to learn, should be very clear. Second, among those things, what have they learned really well? And then third, what do they need to learn better? Now, that information alone is great, but that alone is not going to help them improve. To bring about improvement, that feedback has to be paired with guidance to students as to how they can improve. And so the second implication is that assessments need to be followed with high quality corrective instruction. That you can't expect students to do this on their own. That we need to recognize that if they didn't do well on the assessment, that we have to approach those ideas in new and different ways. And this is not the same as reteaching. I mean, that's one of the struggles that we have when, especially when we're teaching online, is that if students haven't understood something we've explained before, we have this notion, we say it again, only we try to do it louder or we do it more slowly. And we think that that's going to help. And it really doesn't. That we as teachers teach us we learn best. And it's only natural that we should, and we need to continue that. But not all of our students learn best in those ways. And even when they're learning from home, we need to be flexible in our approach to provide for those differences. So high quality corrective instruction means qualitatively different from what we did originally. It means coming up with different examples or different illustrations, a different approach to a problem, a different way of thinking about it, a different way of explaining it. And I know that's really hard to do. I find it's extremely difficult, especially if you're working by yourself, which most of us are today. But to the degree you can interact with your colleagues and use them as resources, I find that it really can be helpful. Here in Kentucky, we've launched major efforts where we are actually getting our high school students to help us in this. The high school students are helping middle school and elementary students to provide this kind of alternative instruction, that the assessment results are turned over to a high school student and they have an online session with the student where they actually go through the assessment and they explain it as they see it. And sometimes just having another person explain the idea can be very, very powerful. But the idea is assessments alone aren't enough. Going over the assessment isn't enough. Telling students what's right or wrong isn't enough. That we have to pair with that some sort of guidance and direction on how they can improve. And if you can accept that, then the third implication is pretty clear. And that is that students have to give it another chance in the assessment to show improvement. That it's not a one-shot deal anymore. That if it's really learning it's about, then students have to recognize that we're on their side and we're really doing this to help them learn better. And so it's not a one-shot do or die assessment practice anymore. That it's an opportunity for you to show you've got it now. And as soon as you show me you've got it, then I'm going to know that we were successful in this, and you will know it too. See, one of the most important things we need to keep in mind when students are learning from home, and this motivation in learning at home is a really big issue. There's probably not another area, though, that we've investigated more thoroughly in all of education and motivation. And what these studies of motivation show us, there's one thing that's more closely tied to motivation, more important than anything else, and that is success. Students persist in activities at which they can experience some degree of success, and they will avoid with passion those things at which they're not successful or believe they cannot be. If you can show students that they can see success while they're learning online from home, they will stay with you. My classic example of this, video games. I mean, if you think about video games, they are exactly the opposite of what we've always told teachers. We always told teachers, you need to make your lessons relevant to students. You need to make them interesting to students. You need to make them somehow tied to their personal experiences. And I think that's a wonderful and very important idea. But think about the video games. Think about games like Pac-Man, the games we started with. I mean, now, what's the purpose of Pac-Man? I mean, when kids play Pac-Man, they gobble up dots. There's nothing interesting about gobbling up dots. There's nothing relevant to anybody's life about doing it. But watch the kids play. Watch the passion, watch the intensity. And all that comes from success, because every time they play the game, they get a chance to improve. Every student who ever played Pac-Man can tell you about the first time they got all the dots and the machine played the song for them. We need to build this into assessments. We need to show kids that they can succeed. And so there's this notion of things we need to avoid. I'm just going to skip over this, but the key to motivation with regard to keeping kids involved is building in that success. And if we can build success in and show them that they can make improvements, that will be the key to helping them stay with us. So basically, 3 sort of crucial steps that you need to keep in mind with assessment practices. Number 1, establish your assessment priority and communicate that to everybody. Kids are struggling today because different teachers have different priorities with regard to assessments. And as school leaders, one of the things we have to do that's critically important for us to do at this time is ensure that we're all together in this, that we all have the same priority with regard to assessment, and that we make sure that we communicate that purpose to our students overall. If your assessment purpose is really to be feedback and learning, it takes you in a slightly different direction than if it was simply accountability and grading. But the important element here, especially when kids move to middle school and high school, when they have multiple teachers, is there needs to be that consistency. Teachers have to have the same consistent assessment priority in the work they're doing. And we as leaders need to be able to engage teachers in that kind of discussion to make sure those priorities are clear, that we have consensus, that we agree upon those, and everybody's sort of aligned with it. Second, want to recognize that different assessment formats require different types of feedback. And so with the traditional assessment formats, if they match your learning goals, great. Lots of information, short amount of time, feedback is relatively easy. But if it's an alternative assessment format, then it poses different kind of restrictions on you. You need to think about establishing your clear criteria and the elements of quality within each of those criteria. Please keep in mind the guidelines that I share with you. Number one, start with your model of excellence and then go down from there. Don't start in the middle and try to go up or down. Number two, keep it to about 3 or 4 criteria. It's a better learning tool. And then finally, describe performance rather than evaluating it. And finally, make sure that assessments become an integral part of the instructional process. Now, this is a big thing to try to help students understand, that assessments don't mark the end of learning. It's not that I teach you for a while, and then at the end of it, I judge how well you've learned from an assessment. But assessments are really part of the instruction. That it's, I'm checking to find out what you've learned well, what you haven't, and what we can do about it to make it better. These are the 3 crucial steps for assessment, effective assessment practice, when we're working on trying to support learning from home. So what I'd like to do is now go back to our discussion groups. I'd like you to think about these 3 major crucial steps, what your reflections are on those, and what questions they generate for you from that. Susan's going to coordinate the collection of questions. We'll take those on, as many as we can for this time, but we'd like to give you about 5 minutes to discuss these issues, why you think they would work, why they wouldn't work, what constraints are upon you in trying to pull this together, and then what we might come to in reaching some consensus about what we can do to move this forward. So, Christy, can we go to those groups now and take about 5 minutes for this?
Yes, I will open up those rooms now. And if new people just joined us in the YouTube, you won't be able to do breakout rooms there, but you can discuss in the chat box. People in the Zoom, I see you're going into those rooms. If there were a few people that joined later in the Zoom, please let me know if you need help. If you don't see the window asking you to join a room, please exit the full screen and see if it's behind another one. I have a few people that were unassigned, so I'm just popping you into other breakout rooms now. So everyone should have a room to go to, but let me know if you need any help.
Okay. So Susan, how was this? Was this, you think, in line with what we need? Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Yes, absolutely. Because we're getting a lot of really reinforcing positive comments. Someone has mentioned that they feel the Alberta Ed guidelines for supporting students at home. So that was the document I had previously sent you.
Yes.
About. They said that they believe that it does align with the priority being on assessment and formative and supporting learning, as opposed to on grading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very much in line. That was a very thoughtful development. The document itself, I really liked. I thought that was very good.
Right. So,
was there anything that you think is in conflict with what folks have heard so far?
No, I don't think so. I think, again, with the emphasis on essential learning outcomes being the priority, as opposed to, because there are teachers that are trying to replicate exactly what they would be doing if they were carrying on, and that's causing a lot of stress. So I think that definitely, when I looked at the questions for the second round, because we also had new people from the previous one we did on April 7th, I was finding that a lot of the questions were the same as the ones from April 7th.
So what about the portion on rubrics? Was that helpful, do you think, or was that different from what people have heard before?
No, I think it definitely aligns. So I think it was very useful for you to really kind of point it back to focused on curricular objectives and really kind of shorten, because it's almost like, because when you were describing it, it made me think of, well, if we're doing essential learning outcomes, then the rubrics should correlate with that as well, right?
Right. What about that notion of starting at the top and coming down versus starting in the middle? Did that make sense?
Yes, it did. It did.
Okay. Because I know that's a little different from what others have taken. I know that, well, my good friend Bob Marzano has a very different approach to that, but we're finding that that's led to a lot of problems, especially with this, sort of learning from home options.
Right. Well, I really appreciated the point about the feedback being not just for students, but it's also to inform teachers.
Mhm.
And because when you said that, I'm like, yeah, that is right. Because I've always looked at it to really inform my teaching. And I let kids know that as well,
Yes.
right? And then they realize, oh, wow, the feedback from us actually drives how you teach. And
Yeah.
so when students understand that it's a reciprocal process.
Yeah. And I find it takes a burden off of students too. You know, when I can admit that, you know, I screwed up. I didn't do this as well as I should have done. Then they have breathed a sigh of relief, you know, that not all the responsibility is on them. That we're in this together.
Right.
So are you getting questions coming in?
Pardon me?
Are you getting questions coming in?
More comments. I just had one from Pat Lohr. She's with the Alberta Assessment Consortium. She says, sometimes I think jurisdictions are pushing against that soft approach and requiring much more, maybe to satisfy parental expectations. Mm-hmm. So the idea that parents are probably expecting that percentage mark, but again, it's also educating and communicating with parents about that piece too, right?
Which is it's such a burden on teachers to try to, I mean, what's the difference between an 85 and an 83, you know, for kids when you're the information you have in that restricted format.
Right, or a 79 and an 80, right?
Yes, right. How many participants did we have today?
We had about just a little over 100 registered.
Oh, terrific. That's great.
Right. So they are registered for both sessions, so it will be the same, but because we've opened the registration, we might have some new people joining us for the second session as well.
Yeah, I've got a whole new session, a whole new presentation for that second one. That's when we take on the grading issues.
Oh, okay, perfect. I bet you're in pretty high demand right now.
Well, I seem to be getting lots of emails and phone calls, that's for sure.
Right.
Well, a lot of this is in response to, I think sometimes people go ahead with policies and don't think about it a lot. So, you know, you get disgruntled parents or disgruntled school leaders that are disappointed with what a state or province has done, and we're trying to find ways to work around it.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you think that's good enough? We can call them back now? Give them
Sure,
a minute?
it'll be fine, especially, and should we just open it up and see what questions come in?
Sure, I'll give them a minute.
Okay.
Christine, you'll let me know when everyone is back.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's my final slide.
Yeah. High impact.
Yeah. So has spring come to Edmonton yet? Are you getting flowers coming up and trees budding?
Yes, our snow is finally melting.
Oh, that's good.
They're all back in the room now, Susan.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. All right, then. So obviously this discussion has generated a lot of our questions. So for this last half hour of our session today, we would like to take on any questions that you might have. So if you could please type them into the chat box, we will do our best to ensure that everyone's question is answered. And so if you'd like to type your question into the chat box, I will just read them to Thomas and he can address it. One of the things while we're waiting for the questions to come in is that piece about the communication to parents, because a lot of parents are expecting percentage marks. So we were just talking about how important it is for the communication going out to parents about assessments as well, and how that should be handled.
Yeah, that's really critically important. And it's been sort of an irony here in the States, because typically when we think about poor practices regarding assessments or grading, we don't have to look much further than our nearest colleges and universities. They, because the faculty there haven't necessarily had a lot of training in pedagogy, nor with assessment or grading. So they often have very poor sort of practices. But in this particular instance, the universities here in the States have really been leading the way in it. They recognized how when we go to remote learning environments, and especially having students learn from home where there are all these restrictions, and also from the faculty perspective, that making these really fine gradations in the performance of students can be very difficult. So it started with the most elite college universities here in the States. I made the mention in the article you read that the University of Chicago, Harvard University, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Duke University, Boston College, Boston University, all those elite schools were among the first to say, we're going to take this burden off. We're going to really let people focus on learning and not have to worry about that accountability part, and went to a, sort of a two-tiered grading system. Now, most, to be honest, did not go with pass-fail. Instead, they went with sort of credit, non-credit, or satisfactory, incomplete. Now, where they set the cutoff for that did vary from institution to institution. Most of the elite colleges and universities set that level for a pass or satisfactory pretty high. So it wasn't that it was going to be just getting by, but it was actually going to be a relatively high level, maybe what would be equivalent to a grade of A or B for a class. My university, we'll talk about this in our next session on grading, did make this change a couple of years ago. We at the university had a 5-level grading system, A, B, C, D, and F. And we decided that that really wasn't necessary, not for college students, that we just decided to drop the D grade. The D was always sort of the gentleman's F anyway, so we just got rid of it. And so now we just have 4 levels. We have A, B, C, and failure. With this sort of satisfactory, incomplete, most of the professors have set a B level performance for satisfactory. And incomplete is a C or a failing, and then students are given options within that to make up that and raise that grade. But even those that got the satisfactory level, at a later time, if they come back and meet certain requirements, that can be commuted to a letter grade at another time.
Right. Okay. So I think that would probably address Colleen's first question, which was, what would you say about the conversation between high schools and universities regarding entrance? We also have another question. After determining priorities, how would be the best way to determine students' understanding in this online setting? And I believe that would be probably referring to that idea of how do we tell who's submitting the work?
Right. Well, and that's where leadership at the school level becomes so very important, because there needs to be consistency in those priorities and in that focus. So that it means that as a school leader, I would have to really make sure that my teachers are all on the same page, and they're all giving their students the same sort of responses, and they all have the same focus, and they all have the same priorities. And that might mean bringing them together in a Zoom session where we as a faculty talk about this. One of the things that's most difficult, and we'll talk about this more extensively in our next session on grading, when we interview students or we interview faculty members, and especially when we interview parents, one of the things that they find most troublesome is a lack of consistency from teachers to teacher within the school. And this is where leadership becomes so critically important. We need to be consistent in that. So if we can get our faculty together, that they're all giving students the same messages, they're all giving parents the same messages, and say our focus is really on feedback. And the purpose of feedback is to help you learn well. So what good would cheating do you? I mean, if you copy someone else's work, it's not any advantage to you, because our focus isn't on the evaluation. Our focus is on helping you learn. And to help you learn, we have to have good, accurate information from you. And to couple that then with this notion of success, I can help you be successful. And you're going to feel so great when you do get this and when it finally comes together. So I think that if we establish that as our priority, we take away the incentive for cheating, and we take away the incentive for plagiarism, those things. That if our focus really becomes learning, then students will come along and understand that it isn't just getting by, but it's really to acquire these skills and develop these kind of talents that we really want. And as teachers, we're here to help you do that.
Okay, thanks. Kathy asks, how often should we assess? So if we're talking about incorporating assessment as a part of our instructional practice, what would be the recommendation for the frequency of that?
Okay, that's a really, really, really important question. And again, Benjamin Bloom, when he first talked about the notion of using assessments as learning tools, did make a distinction between assessment and what he called checking for understanding. Now, checking for understanding is, according to Benjamin Bloom, it's these ongoing things we do as a part of our teaching. So as we teach, we're constantly asking student questions. Just understand it's making sense, getting through. And he thought that was always really important, but we need to distinguish that from a more sort of formative assessment. Bloom's idea was that formative assessment should occur when there are natural breaks in instructional sequence. And even to carry that over into learning from home or remote learning situation. You don't want those sort of learning units to be too short. I would not assess every day, for example, because then learning becomes fragmented and higher level skills are difficult to build. But you don't want to be too long, because then students who may fall behind at the beginning would have great difficulty catching up. So Bloom's advice to teachers was to really think about where those natural breaks occur. He felt that at the elementary level, it might be about once a week, that you'd never like to go much more than a week before you really check to find out if everybody's with you or not. At the secondary level, it might be, up to 2 weeks. But even for my college level students, I don't like to go much beyond 2 weeks because it's too much for them to remedy. So as a teacher, just think about where natural breaks in an instructional sequence might occur, where you would say, okay, let's take a moment here to stop, find out if everybody is with us, and then do what we can to get everybody caught up before we go on to take on new material.
Okay, thanks. Vanessa is asking, how can we support teachers in this assessment journey when they are doing the best they can with what they've got? Some of our teachers require a large shift in pedagogical beliefs, and is now the time to do that? And how can we do it?
Well, I think the advantage that we have is that this has compelled us to focus on what's important for students to learn. So I think that in Alberta, the focus on the essential learning outcomes is very good and very positive. So that it's helped teachers understand that not everything is equally important, that we need to focus on the most essential aspects of that. From an assessment perspective, the question that we have to ask is, are our assessments capturing those things really well? And if there are things on the assessment that don't align with the essential learning outcomes, then perhaps we should eliminate those for this time. But it's that issue of alignment that seemed to be most crucial here. You want to look very carefully at any assessment you use and make sure it does a good job of capturing the information that's aligned with those essential learning outcomes. Once you make that your priority and make sure that it's the assessments that capture the learning, don't be driven by assessments themselves. To really, as a teacher, critically look at any assessment you have, if you've used it in the past or it comes from your instructional materials, to really look at that critically and say, is this getting at those essential learning outcomes that we've established as a province that we think is most important for students to learn? If our assessments capture that well, then they're great. But if you see things on that assessment that don't align with those essential learning outcomes, you should cut them. don't hesitate to alter those assessments. They are carved by people who had no more expertise than you. And your judgment, your professional judgment, this is going to be critical. So I think to really use the essential learning outcomes first as your foundation, and to make sure whatever assessments you have align with those, then you'll be on solid ground.
Okay, thanks. Our next question is from Patty. How do we best support our students' feelings and their learning? Patty, would you like to unmute your mic and perhaps explain or clarify your question a little bit, please?
This is Patty Christensen. Sorry, Patty, you might have to hover over the bottom of your screen to take your mic there.
Patty can also just hold her space bar down.
How's that? Thank you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I was just trying to get at, the students, how they're feeling living through a pandemic, the anxiety, those kind of things. How are we balancing that and helping them with their learning? Because I think that can block their learning, kind of give up, or it's maybe like connecting the competencies. Say looking at perseverance, for example, is there opportunities for students to reflect on that and connect that in their learning? Is there some kind of thinking behind that? Did you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, sorry, I think Thomas is muted again.
Okay, so
Okay, Thomas, you're
Okay.
unmuted.
Okay. Well, Patty, I think you draw a really critically important point here, and that is that our students are under a lot of constraints and restrictions right now, and there's a lot of anxiety associated with this. I mean, when you're homebound, when you're afraid about going out, when you're no longer to have the kind of interactions with your friends that you would normally, or even your family members, it does make it a really troubling time. And that's why I think that the notion of being able to feel confident and competent in something is so powerful, that if we can, in these learning experiences we provide for our students, show them that they can be successful, and not only recognize that success, but allow them to build on that success. I know it sounds rather simplistic, but I just keep going back to that example of the video games. One of the things that video games do so well is they capture kids' attention because they allow them to increase their sense of competence as they go through this. And so even if it's something as simple as gobbling up dots in Pac-Man, you get better at it as you go along. And as you get better at it, you get more excited about doing it, and you want to keep getting better. It's this notion of as I experience success, then it prompts me to be more motivated to gain more success overall. And so if we can build that into learning experiences we provide for our students, where logging on is not a task, but it's an opportunity. It's really a chance for me to get in and learn something new. And even to us to end our lesson with students is to say, when you talk to your parents today, what are you going to tell them you learned today? What new things have you done? What successes have you had today that you can share with your parents later on today at the dinner table, whatever, to capitalize on that notion of success and bring that light to kids' lives that under these difficult and trying circumstances they often don't have. I think it'd be really important for us. So I'd really focus on that. How can I show them that they can be successful and gain the many positive benefits of that success?
Okay. Next question is from T. Martin. High schools are struggling with assessment and reporting, especially considering our post-secondary institutions are still requiring percentage marks. How do we navigate this?
I would, well, if I had my choice, what I would ask the colleges and universities in Canada to do is to take some guidance from those here in the States. They were the first to lead this work of saying, these are some really powerful constraints that our students are under. And we need to recognize that We need to recognize that under these conditions that they are imposing restrictions on students and what they're able to do. So we need to take that into consideration. That's why the most prestigious and elite universities here in the States were the first to not only decide for their faculty what they were going to do for their students, but then to communicate to high schools what they were going to ask of their incoming students. So if you get online, for example, to the website for Stanford University, a very prestigious school here in the States, in the state of California, has said to their entering freshmen, now again, the seniors that are graduating this spring have already made their college decisions, so that's not really going to have a powerful influence on them. But for the juniors that are just getting ready for that, they have these questions about what transcripts are going to look like and what would they be looking for in the admissions offices. And so Stanford University, which has now been followed by Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, University of Chicago, have all said that they are recognizing it on transcripts, these things are going to be different. And we recognize that. Now, what many schools are doing is they are going through a sort of three-tiered process for looking at this, where they're putting the grade onto a report card or transcript with a little mark or an asterisk by it. So this occurred spring of 2020 when students were learning from home and was different. Now, if they have established clear criteria for getting a grade in that class, then as students meet those, then whatever asterisk is placed by that can be removed. And so you can move to this. But the percentage grade system is something that we have challenged, I guess. I think that we're a little bit better in understanding how difficult it can be to actually classify students in a scale that has 101 discrete units, how difficult that can be. How do you determine the difference between an 89 and a 90? And that's so, but to the degree that universities are requiring it, we need to provide those options for the students. And so building in opportunities for students to gain that particular kind of grade, if not now. I think the biggest issue would be, how can we remove the timelines for that to allow students to make up this work and do this work in a more extended time frame, recognizing that then the transcripts can remain flexible and we'll adjust those at their time accordingly.
Right. It just gave me an idea as you were speaking, Tom, that perhaps I could extend an invitation to stakeholders in post-secondaries to join us in our second session.
That would be terrific. That would really be terrific. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Our next question is from Shay. How might we facilitate a conversation with parents and students around assessment and its role in motivating kids to stay with us in the learning?
Okay. Well, that's going to be really important, especially when we're calling on parents to have some instructional role when the kids are learning from home. So I think that the first would be to go through that process of establishing your priority. If you go back to that early slide where we said our priority can be sort of feedback and learning, or it can be accountability and grading. Let parents know what our priority is going to be during this time and why we're taking that as our priority, so that they understand that this is what we're really trying to accomplish and what benefits we feel that can bring and our rationale behind that. Second, then within that, to really stress what parents can do to help us in this. I think that oftentimes parents want to provide all the assistance they can, but they really don't know how. And so to the degree that we can be more open with parents about how they can assist and how they can be really a beneficial aspect of learning of kids when they are at home, I think that'll be powerful. And third, finally, to let parents know that our priority is to really have the kids learn. And so it's the feedback that's really important as a part of the assessment. And that we as educators providing students with feedback, but getting the feedback alone isn't enough. They have to do something with it. And so to let parents know that when we offer students this feedback on their learning, that does prescribe then additional work that needs to be done. Here are the things you're doing really well, but here are the things you need to work on, things where you need to spend a bit more time. And so to let parents know, not only we're providing the feedback, that's our priority, what they can do to facilitate it, but its purpose is to guide. And so it doesn't just say, well, if you've done a good job or not do a good job, but here's some more things you have to do, that it has an instructional purpose along with just an information purpose.
Okay, thanks. And I believe that probably addresses the next question, which was Pat's. So now we're going to move back to Patty's question. How do we determine what is essential for the last 2 months?
Well, that's going to be a really important professional judgment. Now, I think that to the degree in Alberta that we have the sort of essential learning outcomes, that can be, I guess that would be my foundation. I would go with that first, and to recognize that within the curriculum documents that we have, that there's lots there, but it really comes down to making sure we prioritize to those essential learning outcomes that we believe are most important. And then within those, are there core elements within those that really need to be focused on? That if I could just guarantee the kids have this, one of the things that I'd recommend keeping in mind is to think ahead about what is going to be the prerequisite for their success next year. What are they going to be called upon to do next year that they really need this? This needs to be the prerequisite to being able to go in there and be successful in it. We don't want kids, coming into instruction, be it in the summer or as they begin the next school year at the end of summer and into next fall, lacking some important essential learnings that they should have in order to succeed in the next level. So number one, look at the essential learning outcomes within the curriculum for the province. Number two is to then establish what we think are going to be the most essential prerequisites for them and their success next year. Have that guide us. And know that these are profound professional judgments you're being called upon to make, but no one is in a better position to make those decisions than you are. So
I guess
we talk about it, but move in that direction.
Right. I guess it would be aligned with kind of what you were saying earlier about developing consistency. So it should be consistency within that grade level. So those essential learning outcomes could be decided within a school or within a school district level. If we have leaders in the room that are part of the curriculum department for their district, is that might be something that's communicated to help guide teachers with that piece.
Yes, that's a really important issue, Susan. I think to have that kind of consensus and to meet with your colleagues and have this discussion with them so that it can be, we're better together doing this than we are alone. So rather than having to be your individual decision, to meet with your colleagues at your grade level within your school and decide what you think would be most crucial here. I think that's a really excellent idea.
Okay. Michelle is asking, what are steps that a secondary teacher can take to move from marking everything with no second chances to marking with less and allowing second, third, and fourth chances, etc.?
Okay, well, there are two issues here, and both of these we're going to address in our next session on grading. The idea of multiple opportunities is important, but there has to be a limit here somewhere. If you insist on 100% mastery before you go on to something new, then you're putting a great deal of emphasis on the assessment device itself. And there's no such thing as a perfect assessment. All assessments have items that are flawed or questions that are ambiguously worded and misunderstood by students. So that's why when it comes to assessment results, we never say 100%, because then you're assuming you've got a perfect assessment. We never have that. But second, we need to understand that students not only learn things in different ways, but learn things in different order. And so if a student is struggling with an important concept, it doesn't mean that they're never going to get it. It's just maybe they don't get it now. So what I tend to do is that I'll work on something. We'll do our best at it. They don't perform well on the assessment. I try another approach to it. And then I see if they're still having a little bit of difficulty, then I'm going to move on. And then I will spiral with them. One of the most important things you can do within assessments is what we call incorporating spiraling items or spiraling prompts. That when you move on to Unit 2, your assessment for Unit 2 should have a few questions refer back to Unit 1. So you do that for two reasons. One, it's the best device we know to enhance retention, help students understand they have to carry these things over when the unit is next. But second, it's a way of capturing things that might have been difficult for students even though you did move on. So if you're a student in my class, there was a question on the first unit that you missed, and we did some corrective work on it, but you missed it again. Well, lo and behold, at the end of unit 2, there's another question on that concept. And if you miss it there, then we'll do correctives on it again. So by incorporating spiraling items within your assessments, when you do move on, you enhance retention, but you also allow that option for capturing things that might have been difficult for students so they can demonstrate it to you at a later time. You see, the idea is that to guarantee students have learned, it doesn't mean you sit there and pound it into their head before you consider anything else. Multiple opportunities to learn means go on, spiral back to it at a later time. When you spiral back to it, then they're likely to get it.
Okay, thanks. We have time for one more question. We've been focusing on a balanced body of evidence this year, products, observations of process, and conversations in this ongoing learning environment, how we observe a student's learning process.
Well, I think, again, this moves us into that area of the alternative assessment formats, and the format of the feedback is going to be dependent on the format of your assessment. So when you move to the alternative assessment format, just giving them a checklist of what you got right and got wrong isn't very helpful. So to the degree I can use screencasting to provide students with up to 2 minutes of verbal feedback to them. And again, what I do with that feedback is 3 things. Number 1, always start with a positive. Always start by saying, here's the things you did really well. You made remarkable progress since last time, and I can really see improvements here. Number 2, here's some things that you need to do a little bit better. Here's some areas where we need to make some change. Number 3 would be, here's how you can do it. Here's some quick suggestions on how you can make this better. And then I'd actually add a 4th, and the 4th is to express our confidence in students that they're able to do it. You can do this well. I know you can do it. And so just stick to it, keep at it, make these changes, and then come back and show me how well you do it next time.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, we do have a host of other questions remaining, but unfortunately we are out of time. So if Christine, if you could please display how the last slide, how would participants be able to address their questions if they still have burning questions to ask. Just a reminder that we are getting together again on May 6th for a second session to continue this conversation. And so if you registered for the first session, you will automatically be registered for the second session. So you will also, because you're registered for this session, receive a copy of today's recording so you can review Thomas's slides and the discussions that took place. And so at this point, I'm going to say a very big thank you for Dr. Thomas Guskey for sharing his expertise this morning. And on behalf of all of the Alberta Regional Consortia, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time. And we're going to display Thomas's contact information through email. So if you still have further questions, please feel free to shoot Tom an email with your question. And Thomas, did you want to give us a preview of what to expect for our May 6th session?
Sure. And two, I want to thank everybody for taking part in the session today. I know these are really busy and hectic times for you. So to take an hour and a half out of your busy day is really terrific. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Today we talked about gathering information from students. We talked about the notion of focusing primarily on feedback and using it to guide lessons. The next session is going to take on grading issues. So once we get all this information, how do we use that information to develop grades or reports that are going to serve positive purposes, serve well educational purposes, and communicate to all parties and all stakeholders really how well the students have done, and then be able to defend that in good and positive ways. So all the terrible, nasty, ugly issues with regard to grading, we're going to take on next time. And we're looking forward to seeing you then.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we look forward to having you back with Alberta School Leaders. All right. Thank you. Thank you for